welcome to our 2023/2024 African Cup of Nations preview, because Afcon, as I think was the case last time we did one of these, has been delayed over to the next year. So for sponsorship reasons, we are the 2023 African Cup of Nations hosted by the Ivory Coast. But of course, it is taking place over a 4-week period, starting next Saturday, the 13th of January, running for 4 weeks until the 11th of February 2024. So we've got 6 venues in 5 host cities in the Ivory Coast. We've got 6 groups of 4 teams to get through. A quick reminder for anyone who isn't familiar with the path of Afcon, that it runs through 6 groups, very similar to the European Championships if you're over here. 6 groups of 4. The top 2 qualify automatically for a round of 16. And then the 4 lucky losers from the 6 third place teams will go through to the round of 16 as well. I should mention that we're going to go through each group. Charlie's going to give you his fountain of knowledge from African football, because you can laugh, and we used to, but you pretty much nailed it at the last Afcon. So there is a lot of hope to live up to it.
Yeah, well, having said that, Senegal were hopefully an obvious choice last time. But I have the 3 of us, I've only been to Ghana as well. So that sort of puts me a little bit more African-based than the other 2. But yeah, anyway.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be relying on Charlie's predictions, but please do not gamble on them, because they'll probably be useless this time. But let's go through to the group stages. We're going to run through each group individually and each team, and then we'll talk about who we think is going to get through from each group, and we'll give you an eventual winner as well. So let's start with Group A. We've got 4 teams in there. Ivory Coast, the hosts, of course. Nigeria, another very strong team in there. And then the 2 Guineas, Equatorial Guinea and Guinea-Bissau. So, Charlie, let's start with a host. Probably the favourites for Group A, despite the name of Nigeria in there. Ivory Coast have got a very big field to them from the Premier League. 3 Nottingham Forest players, nonetheless. What do you make of them going into this one?
Yeah, I find it bizarre they had to qualify, considering they're hosting it. But anyway, that's they had to go through the qualify. Yeah, I don't know. I think they're quite lucky. The others are in quite poor form. We'll talk about them in a minute. But Nigeria have been hopeless. And I think they were probably going to be the main ones to challenge them for first place in the group. So I think they will win the group. But I don't think it's the best Ivory Coast side in that sense. Obviously, home advantage is huge. They've got some players that I think are probably the wrong side of 30 now. And I think, the way that the Afcon sort of works, the games are really thick and fast and stuff. So for me, I think they'll win the group. But, not necessarily being one of the strongest teams in the tournament. Yeah,
completely agree with you. And I think it's fair to say they've got a lot of depth in the squad, but maybe not those individual stars like they've had before with the obvious, the Drogbas, the Tourés, etc. But let's move on to the second team. You mentioned their form recently. Nigeria have not had the most comfortable couple of years on the pitch, but there's still a lot of talent in that squad, and up top in particular, they've probably got arguably the best striker in world football.
Yeah, and then obviously got, for English fans, Lookman, who played at Fulham as well. So, they're good going forward, but they have been in woeful form. I mean, they lost to Lesotho, and that's no disrespect. Very small nation. Nigeria shouldn't be losing to sides like that. I think they've only won 2 in the last, last year. So I think they won 2 games last year properly. So, and importantly, they lost the Joe Loft derby against Ghana, which was a World Cup qualifier, wasn't it? And stuff like that. So, they've lost, this was obviously to get to Qatar. They haven't really delivered in the big moments for me, Nigeria, and I think that might be their undoing. So I'll be honest, as a bit of an outside thing, because it does happen in Afcon quite often, you get a big team that might finish third. And I think this might be Nigeria. I've got them a debatable second or third. It really does depend which Nigeria shows up. I'm going to be bold because it is the Afcon. I think they might finish third because, as we'll come to in a minute, I think Equatorial Guinea just in better form, a bit of momentum than what Nigeria have got. And I think a bit less pressure on them, to be honest. So yeah, for me, it's nowhere near the best Nigeria side we've seen. And they just seem to bottle it in the big games, unfortunately.
Yeah, I had it very close with one other. I'll be interested to see if it's the same with the next 2 teams. But Nigeria, as we mentioned, massive Premier League influence in the side. Loads of players you'll recognise. But maybe not the case with the next 2 teams. But where's the surprise coming from? We're going to start with Equatorial Guinea, who probably don't have too many familiar names. They're still reliant on their skipper, Emilio Nsu, who's played at Birmingham, most notably over here. But what do you make of them? Because they've been a side who have at times been tough to beat in the past.
Well, they've been consistent. I mean, they're actually unbeaten last calendar year. So that has to give you some sort of, that has to count for something in the tournament. When you're talking about momentum and, I mean, a lot of their players do play in the lower leagues in Spain. So it's the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. I didn't realise that. That's hence why a lot of them are there. But there is maybe an element of that consistency, as silly as it sounds. But, they're familiar with each other. They, and that is the issue with Afcon, because it's mid-season. The preparation time is minimal. So if you've got players who are a bit more familiar than maybe other teams in the tournament, it might be enough to nick you a point here or there. So I think I've got down as a surprise second. I mean, it's a country the size of Latvia. To be achieving what they're achieving is incredible. I think they've got a bit of consistency. They're unbeaten last year. I just think that'll count for something, and that might be the surprise in the group. So I've got them down as second, I think.
And then finally, we move on to Guinea-Bissau, who probably the most notable name over here for English fans is former Luton man Carlos Mendes Gomez. But they have got a player, Mama Balde, who's played at Lyon and been a strong player in Europe. And they've got a couple of bits of quality dotted around, but I thought they might be the more likely of the two to spring the surprise. But you've gone the opposite, obviously, for this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a tough group. I think people talk about Group C being the group with death. I don't think this is far off of it because it really is hard to pick one out. But I think another group. I'll be honest. I think any other sort of pairing, they might well have got through. I think they're just in with three teams that could potentially, depending on how it goes, turn it on. They did beat Nigeria in qualifying, so again, that could count for something. Yeah, I think I've just got them for fourth. However, you could probably flip that around with any of it. I think Ivory Coast would probably still win it, but the other three you could probably put in any order. And I don't think it'd be a million miles off. But yeah, so for me, a tough group for them. Any other group, I think they'd probably get through from 1 to 3 in that sense.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. But I still think there's a chance they could spring a surprise and maybe be the lucky loser in that group. And then it comes down to points with the other third places. But with Group A out the way, I think we're both in agreement Ivory Coast are going to win it. Let's move on to Group B. In Group B, we have got Egypt, Ghana, Cape Verde and Mozambique. And of course, Egypt have probably got the man that's often most talked about going into Afcon, finished in the Premier League in style on Monday night. Mo Salah and Egypt, they're going to be favourites for the group and were runners-up, of course, last time around.
Yeah, I think they'll win the group. There was an element, though, when we did speak about in the last one, I think what Senegal did very well, both in, because I think they play each other in a World Cup qualifier as well. They sort of stopped the supply to Salah, and it did make a notable difference to Egypt. If you can tactically get him out of the game in a sense, their plan B isn't as strong as what I think people think it is. However, in that group, I don't think there's going to be a team that's maybe strong enough to do that. But later on in the tournament, which is why, again, I haven't gotten down to win the whole thing. I think they'll get close, but I don't think win the whole thing because I do think they are heavily reliant on him. And I know it's a bit of a cliche. If you stop Salah, I do think you stop a large part of Egypt's threat. So I know that seems fairly obvious. I can't see it happening in the group, but later on in the tournament, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. And obviously, you look at some of the other stars we've talked about with them before, the likes of Mo El Nene's barely played for Arsenal. Hegazi's now out in Saudi rather than English football. And it's always an aging squad, isn't it? And they always seem to get results. So I think we're in agreement there. But let's move on to Ghana. You mentioned that you have spent time there before, so there's no excuses for getting this one wrong. So Chris Hughton being the manager is probably the key factor for people in the UK, but there are a few familiar names again. Salisu was at Southampton last year in the Premier League. And as a West Ham fan, a man who you dearly missed last night as we're recording this, Mohamed Kudus, who has hit the ground running in English football. And a man at the other side of that, Jordan Ayew, with experience, who's also doing well at Palace down the road in London. So a lot of experience and Premier League quality in this squad too.
Yeah, I think, I didn't think we'd have the set as Chris Hughton, Ghana manager, but there you go. I think, obviously, talk about someone who's very experienced as a manager. I think Ghana's threat definitely is going forward. I mean, Kudus has obviously been in outstanding form. I think, and it's been an Achilles heel of Ghana, even when they had those successful runs in the World Cup, is that defensively have never quite been the strongest. Their fullbacks are brilliant, flying forwards, but defensively not as... They did sort of bumble the way a little bit through qualifying, so I think they'll finish second, because I think Egypt's threat against and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, mediocre defensive Ghana, I think it's going to go one way. But I do think they're too strong, particularly going forward for the other two. However, I don't think it'll be too big a gap between second and third there. I think it'll be quite a close run game that when we get to that one.
Interesting. I've got this as a fairly straightforward group with top two to bottom two. But yeah, I agree with you. Defence is probably the slight difference between the two there. Egypt, always the more organised of the two generally. Let's move on to Cape Verde, who, of course, have sort of in the last few years worked on getting players to come over, whether it be players who would qualify for the Netherlands, normally other nations as well, and tried to build a squad that way. I think some of the notable ones for me, anyone remember Bebe from the 2000s, Manchester United? I mean, that's a name you've got to mention in this preview. They've got a defender from Shamrock Rovers, who you mentioned last time out, I remember in the preview as well, and a few other notable players in between. But this time, compared to the last, more experience in the squad, more caps between them, and a few more playing in Europe at a good level as well.
Yeah, and they've got Ryan Mendes, who has been quite prolific in qualifying. I mean, they've scored a lot of goals in the last couple of years. I think it's 40 in total, which I know. You think how many internationals there probably are between since the last tournament and now. The problem is they've also let in 29, so I think it's not. But I do say again, I think maybe against Ghana completely imploded in the last Afcon because they just couldn't defend, and I think Ghana will be too strong for them. But I think it'll be a close run game. But Cape Verde are very good going forward, and I think you can't disrespect that. So that's why I think it'll be close. So I've got them down for third. However, the potential Ghana implosion, they might nick second just by outscoring them in that sense. So yeah, I think it'll be a bit closer than what people think that game when they play each other. And I also love their nickname, which is the Blue Sharks. So there you go. That's a good one for you. But yeah.
You did tease me with saying you were going to get some nicknames into this evening's episode. I think we're both probably in agreement they're moving on to the final team in the group, Mozambique, that potentially the weakest side on paper, and possibly if they're not able to remain organised, potentially the whipping boys of the group. We've been proved wrong before, but the only thing I will say, they've got a lot of experience and caps in the squad. They're people that have been together for a long time, but I think it's fair to say they'll be organised, but to an extent they are quite limited as well. I mean, they've still got 40-year-olds in the squad with respect to them.
I think, do you know what it is? Their manager, I love to see this in a sense. So the manager, he's only really managed local teams. You have to give him a pronunciation, Conde. Former player, former international. But it's quite nice that they're not doing that merry-go-round. And I mean this in the nicest way possible, where you get a lot of those European managers and they just sort of get a bit of a payday and they go from one country to another in these sort of tournaments. And I think it's quite nice that there is a local interest there. There's a backing of a local manager. I think you're right. I think they'll finish bottom. But I really like and respect the fact that they're trying to invest in the country rather than just getting these, not mercenaries, but people from Europe who, do good jobs, but there's never sustainability with them. Whereas maybe someone like this, a bit more inexperienced, but so it's nice to see. I think that's a nice story, even if they do finish bottom of the group.
Yep, completely agree. And I think we're largely in agreement with what's going to happen in that group, to be honest, probably pretty much in the order we read them out at the start. Let's move into Group C, where we have the champions, another big name, and on paper, a few tricky games in this group. So let's start the group with Senegal, Cameroon, Guinea, and Gambia. By starting with the champion Senegal, of course, plenty of experience in the squad. Quite a few players out in Saudi now who have moved on from the Premier League since the last Afcon, and also plenty of representation from English football. So let's talk about Senegal. Where do you think they're going to be? Can they defend their crown with a few of their star players maybe just creeping over the hill a little bit?
Yeah, do you know, because all four of these teams actually made the knockouts last time round, which obviously at least one of them, and depending potentially on, the third place sort of issue, two of them might not even get there, which is amazing, really. Yeah, Senegal, it's hard. It sounds a boring prediction, but you can't really see them not making the final. They're so strong. I mean, you've got Mane, Nicholas Jackson. My only thing, and I did mention this earlier, you've got Cheku Kouyate's maybe a little bit older, Gay, as well. So some players that may be approaching the wrong sort of side of getting closer to retirement. However, you look at some. They've got the Young African Footballer of the Year in Lamine Camara, who plays for Metz and things like that. So they still, I think they'll be far too strong for this group. I do think they'll get to the final. It's hard. I don't want to be boring and predict them to win it, but I am struggling to see past anyone else who's probably going to challenge them, particularly attacking wise. I mean, going forward, they are so strong. So yeah, I mean, they should win the group. If they haven't, then something's gone wrong massively, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, there is the argument, and I've seen it in a few places, that maybe it's just a huge amount of that core of the squad getting over the hill. For a lot of them, it will definitely be a final tournament. It's whether it's one step too far or whether it's the final swan song. But they balanced it out with a few younger players in the squad. You look at, there was a big injury worry with Pape Sarr at Spurs, another young midfielder who might be able to make the legs, but they seem to have a bit of a balance in there. So getting out the group shouldn't be a problem. But a threat may well be Cameroon, who, of course, again, maybe not so many familiar names as we would have seen in previous years. They've put quite a few younger players without many caps in the squad this time. Probably the most inexperienced Cameroon squad I can remember for many a year. But they've obviously got an Anna in goal, who's not had the best start at United, but is normally a very reliable keeper at Afcon. And they've also got a little bit of quality in attack with the effervescent Vincent Aboubakar, who, of course, had a couple of big moments at the World Cup, didn't he?
Yeah, and Owen Bemo, unfortunately, from Brentford, obviously, he's not going to be there. The only thing is, I mean, they won 2 out of the last 8 games, so their form hasn't been great going into it. I mean, there was the whole thing about Anana. I don't know if you remember, he fell out with Rigobert Song.
Yeah.
He said, Rigobert Song said that he was too risky on the ball, which, maybe the man's a genius, because we've seen that a few times at United. So, someone get him a job in England. But yeah, no, they could finish third, and it could be not because the other teams in that group are particularly better than them, but they seem to have this ability to sometimes just implode and off the field issues. And like we said, a goalkeeper falls out with the manager or something like that. I mean, qualifying was quite hard to judge on a side note very, very quickly because Kenya and Zimbabwe were banned. And we just spoke about this in the last predictions that we did a couple of years ago about government interference and all this kind of stuff. I don't want to get into that, but ultimately it's the teams that suffer. And Zimbabwe was one that we identified as hoping that they can just keep out on the pitch, which hasn't happened. So qualifying was quite hard to sort of judge really because a couple of teams were banned and all this kind of stuff. So you could argue maybe the reason they're not in great form is they haven't had as many fixtures and stuff like that. So I think they'll sneak second, but there's the potential for a complete meltdown off the pitch, which then leads them finishing maybe third in the group. But I think they'll just sneak second purely because they have got that threat going forward, particularly with Vincent Boubacar. And if Fernando's on the form that he can be in, then they've got a very good goalkeeper there as well. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, a shame on the Zimbabwe front, considering their arguably most notable player is at Luton Town and unfortunately just picked up an injury there as well. But as you mentioned, lots of potential things to go wrong off the pitch there. And given the squad, I'm actually a bit worried about Cameroon. So I'll give you in a minute who I think is going to shock the odds out of the two. But let's start with Guinea out of them because they've got a much more experienced squad, lots of caps across the board. Of course, Naby Keita's the most notable name, now moved on from Liverpool, but Premier League fans will know him. And they've got plenty of experience elsewhere too. Maybe not quite got the goal threat in a team. Naby Keita is actually the highest scoring international in their squad with 12. But other than that, you expect them to be a fairly organised team and maybe to spring a surprise. But I said that last time, and I think they're one of the few that let us both down.
Yeah, I mean, they have gone through qualifying quite well, though. I think they only lost to Egypt in qualifying, admittedly twice, but still, so that's no mean feat. They've got Girassi, forgive my pronunciation there, Girassi of Stuttgart. So he's nicked in quite a few. I think he might be only second or third behind Harry Kane in the Bundesliga. Yeah. So he's coming into the tournament in good form. But you do wonder where that, even getting the ball up to him. So I do think that they just lack that. They've got one or two outstanding players. I think there's then a bit of a gap between them two and the rest of them. So for me, I think that lack of depth, might be the reason that I think they'll come third. However, as I say, possible Cameroon implosion, they could sneak second in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. It's reliant on 3 or 4 individuals staying fit and having the impact we think they'll have. They've got some exceptional young players, so maybe in 2 or 4 years, they might be a side to watch out for. And the final team in the group is Gambia. Now, we don't know quite so much about them because there was a delay in announcing their proper squads, and they are on paper probably the weakest of the 4. However, they've been competitive in the past. Do you think they can do so again against what are 3 pretty strong teams in the group?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're the FIFA rankings, the lowest ranked team in the tournament. But I mean, they did beat Mali in qualifying, but then they lost to teams they shouldn't have lost to. So I think it's a bridge too far. I think unfortunately, I don't think they're going to have anywhere near enough to trouble the other 3, unfortunately.
Right, with Group C out the way, I think we're going to move into the second half. And Group D begins with a side that have so often been strong in Afcon in recent decades. It is Algeria. They are in a group with Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Angola. Let's start with probably the biggest team in the group in Algeria. A couple of strong defenders from the Premier League, the likes of Aït-Nouri at Wolves, and going forward, a few recognisable names that have got plenty of goals between them. Slimani and Mahrez, to name a couple.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's just a shame Majid Bouguera is still not there, but that's like they should walk the group really. I mean, they're unbeaten in the last 10 games coming into the tournament. So for me, and they've actually had a couple of players switch allegiance from France recently as well. So that just adds that depth to the squad. No one who's going to be a headliner, but just you got a bit more depth about it, and you do need that in tournaments, especially when the games come thick and fast. You need that depth. So yeah. Not too much to say other than the fact I think they'll absolutely walk it. If they've got people like Mahrez and stuff on form, then really the other 3, which we'll go through in a minute, I can't see them troubling them too much.
Yeah, completely agree with you. I was actually going to mention that with Feghouli reaching 34, to get Houssem Aouar to switch allegiance was massive for them in having a creative spark. And with younger midfielders like Rami Saruki, might well help them out. Second up, Luton interest in the competition, Burkina Faso. Issa Kabore, the man to watch out for there. But they've also at the other end of the pitch got a few recognisable names, the likes of Bertrand Traoré, who always seems to pop up with at least one moment in Afcon. But I guess my worry for them is probably in the middle of the pitch. But there is a bit of experience in there, not a huge amount of creativity. Another side that might have to rely on either width for being disciplined, which their defence might suggest they might not be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, they've got Edmund Tapsoba, who's at Leverkusen, who actually seems to be doing quite well at the minute. However, I don't know. I think they're a surprise, the Stallions, as they're called. I think The only reason I say that is it's a fairly consistent squad from last time,
Mhm.
from the last tournament, and you just think maybe holding that together, that can maybe account for something and can get you, a bit get you over the line in some games. So I think the consistency of having a very similar squad, just that consistency of that. So for me, I think they're my outside bet to try and sneak a second place there. Just because I think there might be that organisation, they're not chopping and changing stuff. So yeah, similar squad. So for me, hopefully that works out for them.
Yeah, and you're right to mention that as well. 4 or 5 players that are mid-20s or younger and have got over 35 caps. There's experience in there despite the age of the squad. So definitely one to watch out for there. And they've got a Luton Town player. They're getting my support. Mauritania are third up. Now, of course, they were one of the stories going into the last Afcon, which you talked about in detail there. But this time around, with that little bit of experience, what do you expect from them? Because they've obviously got a mix of that squad where half of it's got a lot of experience in caps, and then there's people who they've been able to get to switch allegiances and come into the squad recently. Where do you see the magic coming from? Because again, probably the issue for them is goal scorers.
The young lads they brought in are very young. I mean, it's brought down their average age. I think they might have one of the lowest average ages in the tournament. So I think against maybe someone like Angola, I think that youth and that exuberance and that fitness, and we'll talk about them in a minute, I think that might get them over the line in that sort of game. But when they're playing like Algeria, I just don't think those young lads have got the quality for them. I mean, quite a few of them do play in the lower leagues in France. You've got Umar and Gom, who plays for PAO FC in League Two. So they've got players who are obviously playing at a decent level. I don't think it's enough to trouble the big boys. But I think it'll be more than, I think they'll get one over Angola, which obviously reveals my pick for fourth place there. But yeah, so I think Mauritania might actually sneak third.
Yeah, and completely agree. They're making progress based on qualifying twice in a row and moving into the top 100 of the rankings before the draw was made. So positive signs nonetheless. But as you say, the final team in the group is Angola. And again, a little bit of experience in the squad. A few players they've got to switch recently. Jeremy Bella being one now at the age of 30. But what do you make of them? Because there's probably not the 1 or 2 standouts that they've had in years gone by. And there's probably not those 1 or 2 big strikers that they've had in the past. So do you think they're going to be able to cause a threat, or do you think, as you say, they're going to struggle ultimately?
I think they'll struggle. I don't think they've got anything going forward. They won 2 games last calendar year. And you look at some of the teams they played, they really shouldn't have been losing those. I'll let people find out for themselves. There's quite a few off the pitch issues, which is something we really don't like talking about, not just in Afcon, in any tournament, but it definitely has an impact. So for me, I think that coupled with the lack of goal threat and the lack of goals in general, I think they're going to struggle, to be honest. So I think, as I say, Mauritania might nick them in their game purely by youthful exuberance and a bit more impetus going forward. So for me, I think, unfortunately, Angola might get the wooden spoon in that group.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree with you. I had them bottom in there as well. Let's move on to Group E, which is a pretty interesting group and on paper a fairly tightly matched one. We've got a narrower gap between the rankings, particularly in the top 3. We've got Tunisia, Mali, South Africa, and Namibia. Let's start with Tunisia at the top. Again, probably one of the most experienced squads. We seem to say it every time about Tunisia. Caps galore throughout, a couple of recognisable names. And as we've seen in the past, even in recent World Cups and Afcons, they're never going to be the prettiest. They're never going to be the most exciting team to watch, but they're disciplined and they have got those little bits of quality, like the young lad at Sheffield United, Slimani, who's starting to emerge there. I think they could be the strongest in the group, despite it not being the strongest group overall.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, do you know what? I'll go for in a minute. I think there might be Mali might just nick them on. I think I'll go through Mali in a minute. I think the consistency of Tunisia will get them through, but I do think they lack a bit of depth. You mentioned some good names there, but I don't think there's that depth that if they pick up a knock or if the game needs a bit of a tactical change, I don't see. They've got a strong 11. I don't see much past that. And I think when they come up against a strong Mali side, which we'll go through in a minute, I don't know if they'll have that plan B that's going to work around it. So I've actually got them for second. However, I'll go through Mali in a minute. There is a chance they could nick first. The consistency, I think, will get them so far in the tournament. But once they come up against some of the stronger sides, I can't see them really getting past last 16 quarterfinals, something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, moving on to Mali, obviously, as you say, if we were playing this on paper, Mali would be favourites for the group. But as you mentioned, they've had troubles at times in qualifying. They're not the most consistent team. And while they've got good defensive players on paper, while they've got excellent centre midfielders galore in the squad, they have struggled for goals a little bit up front. I think it's the stat that there's nobody in their squads that's got double figures goals internationally. I'm pretty sure that's the stat. But they have got some good players in the team. And in midfield, I mean, the strength is there. Yves Bissouma obviously being a star of them.
It's just that hot and cold. And it depends which Mali turns up. I do think When they've gone, when it's clicked, they've been outstanding. But then, like you say, I mean, they lost to Gambia. There's someone else you mentioned to a minute ago that they probably shouldn't have lost to. Still managed to then win the qualifying group. It really, really, of all the teams in this tournament, you talk about a lack of consistency in knowing which, Jekyll and Hyde, I suppose, for want of a better phrase. For me, that's Mali in a nutshell. If they turn it on, they're probably, a side capable of getting to the last four. The problem is, I don't think they're going to do that for the 6, 7, 8 games they need to get there. So for me, I think they'll win the group, but then, like we said earlier, they could easily just, be the cold Mali that turns up and then Tunisia nick it. So I'm gambling on them being the on-form Mali, only because it's mid-season and their players are relatively fit in terms of they haven't got any big injuries to any big players. So for me, that might be enough just to get them to nick through the group. But yeah.
And then moving on to probably the unknown quantity of the group, because unlike probably previous years and decades when we were growing up, South Africa don't have many players playing outside their domestic league, and we don't have those 5, 6, 7 leaders and stars that we're used to seeing and know about. Now, of course, they may be well hidden in that squad. They've got a relatively high average age, despite the fact there's not too many caps in many areas of the team. But they have got a goal-scoring threat. Aside from that, we don't know a huge amount about them from watching English football because there's no one playing over here. So what do you make of them, and are we going to be surprised?
Yeah, I mean, without going to the nitty gritty of it, I think Lyle Foster might have made an appearance if he was obviously playing. I know he's not at the minute in that sense, but I think that's there's two ways of looking at it. I think there's the consistency of play, 4 or 5 players all playing for the same team in a domestic league, and that has to count for something. That relationship on the pitch. But on the flip side of it, you do have to question the quality of it. They did lose to Rwanda in qualifying as well, which is a huge shock. That shouldn't be happening. So I wonder if the consistency will be enough to maybe get them a win against Namibia. I can't see it troubling Tunisia and Mali though, because I just don't think there's the quality there. And that's not me being ignorant and not knowing a lot about South African football. I think it is just the quality isn't there. And I think the reason being is the outstanding players they have normally left the domestic league, and we're a lot more familiar with them. So I think that's an indication of maybe where they are as a national team at the minute.
Yeah, and I mean, remarkably, they were actually the highest seeded team in pot 3 in the draw, but recent results since then, as you mentioned, might not suggest the same. But then the final team in the group, as you mentioned, definitely the underdogs in it, and Namibia. One name familiar from English football, I think you'd say, is Ryan Nyambe, who's played for Blackburn now at Derby County. But otherwise, again, much an unknown quantity. A lot of players playing either domestically or in South Africa. So again, a very similar situation, but based on recent results and world ranking, you would suggest that they're unlikely to spring many surprises.
Yeah, I think the group's too strong. I mean, they did get a result against Cameroon in qualifying, so you could argue that there is that surprise in them. Do you know what? I think off the pitch, I think it's an amazing story to get there because they were banned for a few years. Like there was no football domestically, internationally. And then the manager, when he got all the players back in, he said they were just too unfit. So I think there has been that process. So maybe there could be the surprise that maybe they're a bit more up to speed now. Because I think the ban was only lifted in 2022. So I know there's a whole year of football, but domestically, it does take that time. So you could argue that maybe they're at a better level of fitness and cohesion. So I've got them down for 4 because I don't think they're going to be strong enough against the other 3. However, the game against South Africa could be huge because you never know, they might nick that 3rd place. And depending on how those other stronger groups go, 3 or 4 points might be enough to get them in through to the last 16 on that. So yeah, I think they'll be 4th, but you never know. There is that surprise in them.
Yeah, and of course, as a lot of their players are playing in South African leagues, you'll be able to see a lot of familiarity there, and they'll know a lot of what they're going to be coming up against. Right, with that out of the way, we move on to the final group, which is Group F, of course. And this one contains the 4 teams Morocco, DR Congo, Zambia, and Tanzania. Let's start at the top of the group with Morocco, the first seed from there. They've got a few familiar names. They've been a side that have had a recently had a good generation. Sorry, of course, again, West Ham representation for you. Amrabat's now at Manchester United, who was a star of the last World Cup. So what are you making of them? Because, of course, Morocco were flying the flag and making history for African football at the Qatar World Cup. What are they going to do now?
Yeah, I think they've just carried on in a similar vein. So I think they should walk this group, to be honest. You got Hakim Ziyech as well, who could be, can be a real good threat going forward. Yeah, they've just got a real good spine. I mean, you've just mentioned about Aged and Amrabat, and I think there's quite a lot of depth either side of that as well on the wings. So I think it's all the makings for a good, strong run in the in any tournament, as was proven in the World Cup. I think the only thing that might be a little bit of their undoing is if they're playing in a group, as I suppose it sounds silly, but they've got a fairly easy group by their standards. It's just then getting up to that speed when you get to, say, the quarterfinals, the last 16, you're suddenly coming up against a potential powerhouse. But I don't think that'll be an issue for them. I think they've got a real good chance with this one. So yeah, for me, they should easily walk the group, and then we can talk in a minute about maybe where they go after that.
Yeah, and as you say, they've got experience out wide. They've got quality. The likes of Hakimi, we haven't even mentioned, and Nesri up front. They've got quality everywhere. So you would expect them to win it. Moving on to DR Congo, who I was planning to be firmly behind in this tournament before they dropped Pelly Kampanzu, which is unforgivable to say the least, especially when you see a couple of the players they've picked instead. However, they have got representation from British football. Vissa, we've seen at Brentford for a couple of years. Diangana's got moments of magic in him at West Brom. And they have got a few other good players as well, but the likes of Kaku to the wrong side of 30 now. Masuaku reaching 30 as well, a former West Ham man. It's an experienced squad, and there's a few players in there that have got a lot of caps, but a lot of inexperienced and new players around it. So what do you make of the balance of this lot?
Yeah, even like Rocky Bashiri, who plays for Hibs, I mean, he took ages to settle there, and even now he's very inconsistent for them. He'll have some games he'll be outstanding, others just woeful. And I think that's probably indicative a little bit of DR Congo. I've got them down for third. I'll go through maybe who will be second in a minute. They're quite good going forward, but I do worry about them defensively, and there is that inconsistency. To be honest, been quite up and down in qualifying. So I think they might be one of the teams that sneaks through in third by when we could talk about Tanzania in a minute, potentially goal difference and stuff like that. Maybe get a draw with someone else like Zambia. I don't know. I've got them down for third, I think, but it's quite close for me between second and third with them and Zambia as we come to in a minute.
Well, yeah, moving on to Zambia, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think these two will be close. And part of the reason is it's not just Zambia, is it? It's Avram Grant Zambia. And that's going to make this all the more interesting. Of course, they've got a bit of stardust in the team with the likes of Patson Daka up front, a few midfielders playing in Europe as well. But Frankie Masonda, a former Luton youth player, not been the most consistent in the Scottish Championship this year, but great to see him playing at Afcon. And again, we mentioned it, a lot of players playing domestically in the Zambian league and a few at the same club as well. We've seen it before with Zambia. Potentially that could help them.
Yeah, I mean, just first of all, their nickname is the Copper Bullets, which wins my award this year for the best nickname of a team in the Afcon. No, the thing is, again, it's that consistency. I mean, Frankie Musonda, you would have known a lot better than me, but even in Scotland, some of the mistakes, some of the goals that he's culpable for, it really does worry me a little bit. However, they won the qualifying group, and for a country of that sort of size and the stature of players that they've got, you can't be sniffed at. I mean, they've got Fashion Sakala, who again at Rangers was sometimes brilliant, other times horrendous in front of goal, but there is that homegrown element. So I think if you've got maybe that core of players who are used to playing with each other, which you spoke about earlier, with a little bit that I've mentioned, sort of still from you, about a little bit of stardust there, I think they can sneak second because I think they've got a little bit of quality going forward if they can harness it in the right way. I mean, Avram Grant, for all of the stick that he gets, he is an experienced football man, whatever you think of his achievements. And he has done some good jobs. So this might be another one for him. And, a bit of an underdog. I think it could, for me, they're not going to beat Morocco. I don't think they're going to win the group. I do think they'll get the better of DR Congo probably. And therefore, I think they'll finish second, purely based on that consistency.
Yeah, I'll be honest. When I was going through this, I had both of them teams on 4 points. Whichever way they go round, they'll both get through if they've got 4 even in third place. So agree with you there. Now, I know you mentioned the team that are now lowest in the world rankings earlier on, but the team at the time of the draw who were lowest ranked was Tanzania. And they're, of course, going to be the outsiders for this group. I mean, they've picked up a couple of players from the National League, which is always interesting to see. I'm a big fan of that. And again, virtually all of the squad playing domestically. They're not a squad that's littered with names. And again, you've got sort of 2 or 3 star players that have been there for years and years and years. And then a young squad and a very young squad overall, trying to do the job around them and be the legs. But are they going to be able to pull up any trees in this group? It's a tough ask.
No. I can't see them doing anything. I think unfortunately they'll get beaten by all 3 teams there. I think it then comes a little bit down to goal difference, maybe with Congo and DR Congo, and Zambia. I feel like they are flying the flag for sort of non-league English football though, because there's quite a few names in there. There's players from Telford, Wealdstone, Boreham Wood. There's one from Ilkeston. I'm not even sure what league that is. Maybe, yeah, Northern Premier Conference North. Not even too sure. It's heroic that they got there in the first place, to be honest. But I think that's as far as they're going to go. However, I mean, what an experience for some of those. And I imagine some of those, like lads who are at Wealdstone and stuff, they're going to be part time. So incredible experience being a part time footballer and then going to a major international tournament. So yeah, for me, I'd love them to nick a result just because it would prove how good non-league football is in this country. But I think, unfortunately, it's a bit of a bridge too far, the group that they're in.
Yeah, and obviously the fact that so many of them, I think I'm just going through the squad now, 10 players that have been called up that haven't made a cap before, who have either been called across, and a lot of them are the ones that haven't played domestic football in Tanzania. So I think we know it's going to be maybe the start of a long progression, a bit like we saw last tournament with Mauritania coming along, and then maybe in 2 years being in a better place. But we've done the easy bit. We've gone through the groups, and we know we're always going to get stung by one shock, but generally the groups have worked out pretty favorably for predictions this year. We're going to skip straight ahead to the main event. We did this last time and you looked very good. So who's going to be in the final and who's going to win Afcon 2023/2024?
The hard bit for me is that Senegal were at their peak, and you mentioned it earlier, and I think there's just, they'll be in and around it, don't get me wrong. The sensible option is to go for Senegal, and I think the head would say Senegal. Part of me just thinks Morocco have just hit, a bit like Senegal did a couple of years ago. They've hit that form at the right time. They've got that experience of players who are playing in the top leagues, which is sometimes what you need to win an Afcon. It's just players who are playing at the elite level. And I think, so head is probably saying Senegal, Morocco final. As for who wins that, I'm going to be bold this time. I'm going to go Morocco. I think it'd be boring for me to say Senegal, but I think it might be those two. I mean, I'm saying that I haven't actually checked the tournament tree that they can even meet each other.
I was doing it as you were doing it. Yes, it will be a final if they meet. If
So
they
I
both
do
win their
think-
group, as you predict.
I think that's probably the final. As for then who wins that, I mean, that's a tight game, that really. You know, because you're talking at two real big powerhouses at the moment. I mean, you can't write off Algeria, Egypt have been around it, but I think, yeah, that's the final. I'm going to go for Morocco, but it could quite easily be Senegal. But I just think Morocco are peaking at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working through this draw. It's quite a tricky one because if Ivory Coast and Senegal win their groups, they meet in a semi-final, which does home advantage give Ivory Coast a chance there. But again, as we mentioned, they've not got that individual stardust we've seen before. Morocco potentially, if they win their group, could meet Egypt if they win their group as early as the quarterfinals. And I kind of feel that Morocco-Egypt might well be the decisive game, and we could end up with a bit of a barnstormer there. And it'd almost be a shame that that's a quarterfinal if it's the case. But I was going to go with Morocco with you, but I don't want to go for the same thing because then I'll look like an idiot as well. Run it into the corner flag. I feel it's going to be Senegal's swan song. You know, there was part of me that thought they might be over the hill, but this is the last chance for so many of that squad, and they are getting on a bit now. There's a lot of experience in there. I guess you could say the same for Algeria as well, with a lot of their attacking talent. But I just feel with the younger players they've added in, with the quality they've got, I guess a very similar climate to be used to as well. I'm gonna go for Senegal to upset the hosts in a semi-final and then go on to win Afcon in a final against probably Morocco out of the two. I think if they get past Egypt, they make the final, and whoever wins that quarter is the other finalist for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more with you in that sense.
Well, we've made our risk this year. We looked very good 2 years ago. I'm pretty sure this time lightning doesn't strike twice. We're not going to be that lucky. But that is our preview of Afcon 2023 officially taking place starting on the 13th of January 2024. Maybe we'll come back afterwards and see just how bad we looked in the middle of February. But that is our preview of Afcon. Thank you very much for coming along and watching it. If you enjoyed it, please do chuck a thumbs up on the video. More importantly, let us know in the comments how wrong we are and who's going to win Afcon. You all told us off for a couple of our predictions last time, and you all got them wrong. So I'm hoping we'll be able to do the same again. If you want to stay up to date with everything else, subscribe, turn the notification bell on. We've got Championship and Premier League predictions most weeks and more manager specials coming up soon. But thank you to Charlie Betts for his reappearance on the channel. Always gets the most views because he is the voice of the people. And we'll see you again here next week as the Championship and Premier League return after FA Cup third round week.